Getting to the end, let's do a quick list of myths. These are things that we hear the robotaxi companies and the autonomous vehicle trucking companies and other autonomous vehicle companies talk about, and they just aren't true. So let's just dive in here. First, humans are terrible drivers, and 94% of fatalities or 94% of something are due primarily to human error. Both of those statements really aren't true. Human drivers are actually pretty good, especially if you take out the drunks. And the 94% human error is just a misattribution. If you look at the source of that quote, one sentence says 94% of some aspect of the crash had a human participation, but in the very next sentence it says that does not mean we're blaming the drivers. It's just wrong. There's no basis for saying that. Computers lack common sense. They're going to make mistakes too, and nobody knows how this is going to turn out. So it's not true that computers are automatically better than people. Both of them make mistakes. The next one is we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 million miles of testing. Look at us, we have 5 million miles of testing. Well, if you've gone 5 million miles without an injury, that's pretty good, but the companies haven't managed that. If you've gone 5 million miles without a fatality, that's good, but it's only a start. And now to be clear, some companies may say we had an injury or fatality and it wasn't our fault. But the number you're comparing against is not at fault. If it's 100 million miles between fatalities for the US or for a city, it's not 100 million miles between at-fault fatalities, it's 100 million miles between all fatalities. And it doesn't matter whose fault it is. If you have a higher fatality rate, that's bad regardless of fault, and if it's lower, that's good regardless of fault. All that having been said, we've got 5 million miles of testing. Well, okay, 95 or more million miles to go before we know how it turns out. I understand some companies have very sophisticated predictions that they're on track to winning that race to reduce human fatalities, and that's great, but we don't know how the race is going to turn out until we see, and we're a long way from that. So it's okay to say we have 5 million miles of testing, but that doesn't actually prove you're safer than a human driver. The numbers are a lot bigger to actually get the kind of evidence needed to prove that. The next one is level 2 or level 2 plus autopilot type systems make cars safer. There have been tons of claims about this. I've never seen any data that supports that. Now the tricky bit is companies will say ADAS makes cars safer, therefore level 2 is safer. Well, you have to unpack that. Advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS, are things like automatic emergency braking. Automated steering is not an ADAS feature in those studies. So yes, automatic emergency braking absolutely helps. But sustained steering is not in those studies. There is no data I've seen that says sustained steering improves safety, saves lives. And there is a pretty good study that shows that it actually slightly decreases safety. And that was a comparison of the feature turned on versus the feature turned off in the same car. And it turns out it crashed a little bit more with autopilot turned on than off. So you can't believe this technology will automatically save lives. The next myth is we, the manufacturer, take responsibility, followed by whisper, for product liability. Well, product liability, of course they have to take responsibility. That's kind of the law. But the more urgent issue is not product liability, it's tort and criminal liability. If there's a crash and the car is driving, does the driver go to jail? Does the driver have to hire a lawyer because it's unclear whether it's the driver's fault, even though they were told by the manufacturer it's okay not to watch the road? That's what's on fire there. And we need to clean up that system to make sure everyone understands what the rules of engagement are there. Because right now, it's kind of a mess. And the last myth is that current laws and regulations are enough. Well, I just said liability is a mess. It turns out there are a bunch of places in the current laws and regulations where we don't know how it's going to turn out. Not knowing how it's going to turn out favors the companies because that allows them to buy time, and they're the ones with the big teams of lawyers. So it needs to be a level playing field for everyone else that isn't the self-driving car companies to have clear rules so we know how things are going to turn out. Some of the issues are liability issues, software safety regulation, for example, the companies following their own industry safety standards, and closing the level 2 plus loophole, which is where we have a car that pretty much drives itself almost all the time, but not quite. But the fine print says, but it's the driver's fault if it crashes. That needs to get addressed. Also, there's very little regulatory pressure to make sure the promised benefits happen. There's lots of promises. Some of those may come to true, but some of them may not come to pass even if the technology can do it just because the business model doesn't support it. And so if you want to have the outcomes, you need to have regulations to ensure the outcomes actually happen.